Hello, my name is Mark McCarville. I'm the founder and CEO of Mindseed Limited, a space technology consultancy company based in Ireland. In this new series of podcasts, we'll be speaking to companies and individuals working in the space industry to explore what they do and how they got involved in space-related technology. We aim to make the conversations engaging and interesting while trying to demystify the whole business of space, bringing it down to earth and relevant to everybody. In our consultancy work, Mindseed engage with all sorts of companies and organisations, in many cases bringing them into the space industry for the very first time. People are generally unaware how space technology affects their lives, but as the space sector is growing enormously, it will affect daily lives of more and more people. Space technology links every smartphone user, food delivery service and weather report, and will become an intrinsic part of future technology development. Our podcast series will try to cover what is happening in space and hopefully engage people in some of the journeys that the companies and individuals have undertaken to work in the industry. If you want to follow up on any of the material in this podcast or anything we'll be discussing, please email info@mindseed.ie. In our first interview, we'll be joined by John O Donoghue, CEO of Inbio, an Irish technology company based in Dublin. Inbio are a materials science company and have developed a coating for a satellite, which is the nearest man-made object to the sun. So John, I'd like to introduce you to everybody. Maybe you could give us a background on yourself and tell us your magical story.
Yeah, well, I suppose first, Mark, thanks very much for having me here. It's a privilege. My own background, I grew up in Wexford in Enniscorthy, went to college in UCD, did mechanical engineering there and graduated in 1986, and worked for most of my career up to when I started Inbio in 2006. I worked in the medical device sector, so didn't really do a lot of mechanical engineering per se. It was whatever the job dictated at the time, but I went back to college to try and get a more relevant qualification in what I was doing. So I took on a master's in biomedical engineering in Trinity, and that involved me doing some of the course in the University of Limerick and some in the University of Ulster as well. And I just got very interested during the master's in materials that I had been working with in the medical device sector, but had never really had a chance to do any sort of research around them. So that kicked off a whole new world for me, So, materials is my game now.
I'm intrigued to know, initially, when we all leave college, we all go different routes and different things, but I'm intrigued how you got into that sort of initial market. How did you get into the initial space? Was it by design? Was it by fluke? Or how did that happen initially?
Some of it was, I suppose, a little bit of all of the things you mentioned there. One of the directors in Inbio is my brother-in-law, Joe O'Keefe, and he had started a company called Sensel in Cork. I think they were connected with the Tyndall Institute, and he had already been working with the European Space Agency and was adamant that the technology that we started Inbio around would be of interest to the European Space Agency, and so he made the connection with the engineering team over in Estec in Holland, where I suppose the European Space Agency have their technology headquarters. And what ensued is a little bit of a whirlwind because it was a bit surreal. They were immediately interested in the technology, and we didn't really understand why. And then it started to emerge that they needed a coating for this mission that they wanted to launch to the sun to do scientific experiments and understand weather patterns on the sun a bit easy, have a better understanding and a better insight. And they started to talk to us about putting down coatings on titanium. And that's what we had been doing in the medical arena. We'd come up with a way to coat titanium implants going into the body for, say, orthopedic or dental applications, and to put synthetic bone on. So I'd come up with a new way to do that. But when the European Space Agency heard about it, they wanted a black surface on the titanium heat shield of the solar orbiter. And started to direct us down that pathway. So it really came from, Joe O'Keefe spotting an opportunity and, taking us off of our medical device pathway for a little bit and introducing us to the space arena. And the European Space Agency then really took us away from our medical device pathway and put us on a space pathway.
But I suppose back to that thing, back to the prosthetic piece, and this is what you were basically, you were using implants for people's bodies, and I presume that the process you had developed, it meant that autoimmune responses were diminished, or it was better for people to use your particular solutions because they were, if you like, safer, or there was less, immune response to them.
Well, with the coating we were putting down, it was more to do with engineering integration of the implant into bone. So if we put synthetic bone on the surface of metal, and that's placed into the patient's skeleton, the bone from the skeleton starts to grow towards the bone on the outside of the metal. So it was really integration of the implant and to give it a very, very solid fixation in bone. We could put drugs into the bone coating that would give you your antibiotic effect, or your maybe induce better bone growth or faster bone growth using morphogenic proteins and that type of thing. But we really were targeting just putting plain synthetic lab-grown bone powder onto metal and using that to good effect in the body. But the very fact that we could coat metal in the way that we were doing it, we didn't realize that at the time, but the technology was sort of generic across all sectors.
Okay. I suppose the question on that is that you've gone from a prosthetic and specifically designed prosthetic to coating a satellite near the sun.
Yeah.
I'm assuming that the essence of that was that the thermal qualities of this particular process were particularly good. I mean, in terms of what's the genesis, I mean, how did people in the European Space Agency first assess your technology? Were they looking at the prosthetic? What was that kind of sequence? How did they understand what they could do with what you had already developed? That's, I suppose, the key piece.
I suppose the main thing, most people will consider coatings in the context of paint, right? You put something on top of something, and therefore it gives it a different functionality than it would have had before, whether it's an aesthetic or a practical application. It changes the metal in terms of what it would have done before. So what our secret sauce was, we were taking off the oxide layer and replacing it with something else, but we weren't adding weight and we weren't adding volume, and that was immediately advantageous from the perspective of the European Space Agency engineering teams. Not adding weight is huge, right? So what they wanted was a thermo-optical surface. We would see it as black and white. White in space tends to reject energy, repel it, or reflect it away, whereas black will absorb it in the same way as, even on a cold day, a cold sunny day, the dashboard on your car gets warm because it's absorbing all of the energy from the light and converting it to infrared energy, which is heat. So they wanted a black surface on the heat shield of the solar orbiter that would take in all the energy, convert it to infrared, and then the heat shield is designed to repel that energy to deep space at right angles to the heat shield. So it was taking it in by facing the sun, converting it to an infrared energy, and then pushing that energy out to deep space at the sides. So by the time you got from the front of the heat shield, which is up around 550 to 600 degrees Celsius, to the back of the heat shield, it's gone down to around 30 degrees Celsius, which is comfortable for the electronic instrumentation that was in the craft itself.
It's an incredible journey to have gone from, basically prosthetics to coating satellites. As a matter of interest, what was the name of the project? What's the name of the satellite? What was it launched?
The satellite is the Solar Orbiter. So we would have known the project as SOLO. SOLO, yeah.
Okay.
And There was never a name put on our aspect of the project because we were very late coming to the table. What it did was had the European Space Agency at our back and Airbus propelling us forward, excusing the pun, but that's what happened. They really pushed this because they were desperate. We didn't know it at the time, but we were mission critical. Without our coating, this mission wasn't going up because they had nothing else that would allow them to meet all of the criteria of the mission. They would have had to sacrifice some of the instrumentation, or they would have had to sacrifice fuel in order to put a heavier coating on the heat shield.
Okay.
Because we had no weight, it allowed for them to meet. We weren't the perfect coating, but we were the closest that they could get to meeting all the needs. So we became mission critical without knowing it. And then they asked us to develop a second coating. So the first coating was black, and we looked for a long time to find a material that was black and wouldn't outgas in space. And outgassing is dangerous because what it means is, materials gather on the lenses and the optics of the instrumentation and blur the sort of images that they're trying to take. So you couldn't have anything that would outgas, and we couldn't find anything that didn't have an organic material in it. Mm-hmm. And one night in desperation, I was trying to figure out what could we put on the front, and I went back to basics and said, well, we put down bone very successfully. We know that we do that. And I started to look around for black bone, and then realized that bone had been used as char bone in cave paintings and that type of thing, and did a very quick search on black bone powder, and sure, like it's everywhere, because that's how, after the BES or the BSE issue with
mad
bone
cow
meal,
disease, yeah.
mad cow disease, and all of that, all bone is now burned. So looking into it, like, they'd been burning bone for centuries to make pigment for paint, fertilizer, and it's a chelation material for taking heavy metals out of municipal water supplies. It's used to whiten sugar. It's used in so many things, and it had already been used in space on the Voyager mission to make the target, the cross-shaped target for the docking of anything else onto spacecraft once it was in orbit. So, but it had been used on the Voyager mission to put markings on the outside of the craft. So so it was a ready-made answer, and all of a sudden we were in business. Yeah.
It's an extraordinary example of, knowing opportunities or identifying opportunities for something. I mean, seriously, like, you've gone from potentially cave painting, the Lascaux cave painting, to an object, closest to the sun.
Yeah.
I think it sort of brings to bear really the essence of what we wanted to talk about in these podcasts, is that the applications for things are enormous.
Yeah.
And sometimes the opportunity to actually use those kind of chances or identify them is hugely important.
Yeah.
And if you can understand how you can plug things into different sort of technologies or different solutions, sometimes you might find yourself in a wholly different place. Like you guys, I mean, you went from sort of, medical implants effectively to coating satellites. I mean, if you'd said that to you at the beginning of your journey, you would have said, no, that's never going to happen.
Well, that's what we said to Joe. It was Joe's vision and his persistence, and the fact that he recognized, having been over with the I suppose, promoting Sensel in Europe and the whole lot, that he had that scope to see that this could be interesting. And the timing was sort of uncanny, because they were trawling the world for a technology, and we happened to be trawling the world looking for a customer. Yeah. And we became, from that point, I think it was in 2010 that 2009 that he started making the introductions, but in 2010 the European Space Agency were sitting up and taking notice, and we moved up from FOTA in Cork to UCD, and then with the backdrop of UCD behind the technology, all of a sudden the European Space Agency were seeing us as somebody that they could do business with. Mm-hmm. And they held 2 or 3 of their design reviews for the solar orbiter in Dublin, in UCD, on the basis of trying to bring us into the project. And then we became the fastest adopted technology in the history of the European Space Agency, from concept through to flight hardware.
That's incredible.
Yeah.
a question as well, I suppose, and this is, and it's part of what we want to talk about. People say, okay, what's space got to do with me? I mean, the solar orbiter is looking at the surface of the sun. There's many reasons why we should do that. And I think that for the purposes of what we're saying here, your incredible journey has delivered a system that is in fact watching everybody's back, really, because, you know, the conditions on the surface of the sun have a direct impact on what happens to us here.
Yeah.
And particularly, I suppose, with the growth in electronics and the use of telecommunications, all of that technology is particularly susceptible to solar radiation. And I think for the purposes of the value proposition of the solar orbiter and how that fits in the big picture, you've really contributed significantly to monitoring the environment to the benefit of all, really. I mean, it's the value is very, very high, is what I'm saying, and what you've done.
Yeah,
you know.
well, you know, it's not often we hear it framed like that. You know, for us, it was working in a lab, you know, in our workshop, and trying to keep pace with the requests and sort of demands of the likes of Airbus and the European Space Agency team, who were, you know, working at breakneck speed to do something. So we never really got a chance to think too much about what we were doing on it until it was done. Yeah. And then it was on the craft, and the craft was then delayed for numerous years. Like, it was meant to launch in 2017 and it eventually got up in February 2020. And it was only when it was done that we really started to appreciate the magnitude of the mission, like, and even then it's still sort of surreal. Like, you know, it's very hard to understand, you know, what our impact has been on that, and how fortuitous we were, how, you know, the whole thing came together, and all of a sudden, like, we were gone from being nobodies to somebody in the context of this mission. But we're, you know, to a large extent, we're gone back to being sort of nobodies again, because it's up there now, and like, it was a once-off mission, and we do a lot of work in the space arena, but nothing has the notoriety. And this doesn't even have the sort of notoriety that we were expecting, because it launched in February 2020, as I said, and in March 2020, like, there were, you know, Italy was in a serious place with COVID, and so was Seattle, so was New York, and the world changed, and the solar orbiter sort of faded out of everybody's vision, you know, and hasn't really come back into play. I think it will as the mission goes on, because it'll start taking pictures of or data from the poles of the sun. It's moving off that equatorial plane as the years go by and moving up, and you know, taking a non-equatorial run around the sun, and progressively more the angle changes more, so to be able to look at the north and south pole of the sun as the years go on, and then I think it'll start to play a bigger part in our knowledge.
In the big picture.
In the big picture,
But this is the thing, I say, you know, and this is what we wanted to talk about as well, that space seems so distant to people, you know. I mean, you know, if you stand on the ground and look up, space is roughly about 50 miles above your head, you know. Yeah. And that's where, you know, the world stops, you know. You're in the vacuum, you know. But in the perspective of what you're looking at, sometimes you don't realise in the context of history what you've actually contributed to. And it's like most people, you know, they might have done something and not really thought about it, but in the big picture, it's actually quite important, you know. And I think that's something that you have to bear in mind. But and on that basis, I suppose, there's also the fact that this sounds fantastic, which of course it is, you know. I think it's an amazing story, it really is. But in the context of, you know, your personal journey and the business journey to get there, I know from experience of myself and other people I know quite well that, you know, sometimes the big story sounds great, but it is the old story of, you know, 98% perspiration, 2% inspiration, you know. I think sometimes the journey is a difficult journey. And I suppose from a business perspective, I know that you had developed initially your medical sort of business, and then it emerged into this. And then, as you said quite rightly, that there was a, you know, you get it up there, it's a great story, but then what happened subsequently, I suppose, is the key thing. And I suppose what we have to really discuss as well is that, you know, if you want to develop something and you want to build your business and you want to be able to stay in an industry like space, you know, you really have to continue to kind of work with the organization, and you have to work with the stakeholders in that industry. And I suppose this brings us to the question, like, in terms of what else or where else you could go with this, has there been any other progression following the solar orbiter? You know, in terms of say engagement with the space industry at the moment, you know, is there opportunities for you to get into other areas in the similar way you did with the initial project?
Yeah, well, I suppose there's a few things have happened. We did go back to our roots in a sense with, you know, the medical technology, but not in the way that I was expecting or hoping to an extent. I still think that we have probably the best bone interfacing technology in the world, but it's not being used in the human body. What we did instead was in 2014, when we had most of the work for the European Space Agency Solar Orbiter mission complete, we started to look at other technologies. Ken Stanton, who was working as a researcher in mechanical engineering at the time, started to work with us, and you know, we worked on looking at what else we could put down on surfaces, and you know, a lot of our own team came up with different ideas. One of the things we started to concentrate on was putting fluoropolymers or Teflon type materials on surfaces. And so we were working with the shoe industry, the tire industry, anyone that was molding a sort of an elastomeric material like rubber, and trying to take it out of molds without using spray-on mold release. So in a sense, we were doing the equivalent in industry as a non-stick surface on a frying pan or cookware. And we got an enormous amount of interest in that. Some of it died away over COVID. You know, a lot of businesses changed how they went about their work over COVID, and it affected us. But another project that we took on and that we're starting to see an enormous amount of interest in is putting down epoxies on surfaces for bonding paint or glues to metal. In 2017, one of our team, Barry Toomey, headed up a project to apply to the European Commission on a H2020, you know, for funding under that umbrella, and we were accepted. And we have the strongest bonding of paint or glue to metal that we're aware of globally. So instead of putting down something like bone or putting down a fluoropolymer, we're putting down the epoxy components that you would find in a paint or a glue, and using them to prime the metal. So most people will use, say, grit blasting technology to put a mechanical key on metal. We use a grit blasting technology, our own technology called Co-Blast, to put both the mechanical key and to put a chemical on the surface. And in this instance, the chemical would be an epoxy. And when we put paint on that, you won't take it off. So you can put less paint on to get the same aesthetic or protective or whatever other function your paint is doing to get that coating on the surface. So the other aspect of that then is putting glues down and getting this phenomenal bond to metal. Normally when you put a glue, you glue something to a metal and you try to pull it apart. It's the metal interface that fails. The glue will peel off the metal. Well, we have never had an instance where that's happened. It's always the glue will fail, or it'll fail on the other interface, you know, whatever it is you're bonding to the metal. So that was the benefit of doing that H2020 project. It finished in October 2019. We were about to do a big launch on the solar orbiter technology and on the H2020 technology, and COVID took over, and we're now back in that trench again, trying to promote the technology some years later. Yeah.
So I think the message of this is that, you know, persistence. Yeah. You know, like you discover and excitement. Absolutely. Yeah, yeah. I mean, you discover amazing things. You find amazing applications for them.
Yeah.
In and of themselves, they are brilliant. But it's the continuous work that you have to do to bring them on and bring them forward. With regards to your coatings and the Co-Blast technology, it strikes me that there's an awful lot more sort of opportunities, even in aircraft sort of manufacture and in specialist equipment manufacture. Yeah. There seems to be a bunch of stuff there that your work would percolate into sort of space, but also, you know, the aviation industry and into all sorts of different places. It brings us back to the point is that sometimes if you discover something or you've got some sort of skill, finding a home for that can bring you in a totally different direction. You may have thought yourself going down one road and you find yourself in a wholly different place.
Yeah.
But in terms of, I suppose the next steps for Embio and where you're going to go, it strikes me that you have a lot of opportunities at the moment. So is there anything you can tell us about where you might be going next, or where some of those applications might lie?
As you can imagine, space has a limited volume, even with the huge expansion of satellites and the CubeSats and the whole lot. While there's a big increase in the volume of crafts that are going into space, they're getting smaller, right? So, and the other side of it is, like, compared to, say, the automotive industry, it's still very, very limited in terms of volume. So we see ourselves as wanting to develop technologies that are, I suppose, conducive to a sustainable world. The big benefit and why we got the H2020 grant is that to put our coating down, or our surface modification stroke coating primer on a metal, it's based on a grit glass technology. What we do is we take typical grit in relatively typical equipment and mix in the material that we want to put on the surface with the grit. We blast the surface in ambient conditions, and the grit knocks the oxide layer off, and the metal underneath, for a tiny window of time, is now naked and very, very reactive. That's what your spark is when you're angle grinding or doing something else with metal. It's that reactivity that we capture, and it bonds the other material that's shooting at the surface. So the grit knocks off the oxide layer, and the metal underneath grabs the other material in the blend. And so it's very clean. There's no dirty chemistry, no toxic materials used. There's very little energy used, and yet we have one of the most fundamentally basic, natural, first principle bonds to metal that is turning out to be one of the strongest bonds that you would want in industry. So we're very clean, but we're also new, relatively speaking. Even though in Embio we don't consider ourselves new, it's very hard to change hearts and minds in an industry where, metal-centric industries are conservative by their very nature. So people don't want to do new things, regardless of whether it's medical device or space. We were lucky with the solar orbiter because they had a need and they pushed us. But in other sectors, like, you're working against incumbency, and that's changing minds is difficult.
Yeah,
So,
I mean, it's always the same story. You've got people say in a business, who are your competitors? Sometimes they may not be a direct competitor. Sometimes the competition is just the inertia of the market.
It's breaking
down
in.
the new barrier.
Yeah.
But it strikes me as well, though, you've a great opportunity perhaps in sort of fuselage structures and stuff like that. With this technology, you could potentially build very, very, very strong, very lightweight sort of fuselage for aircraft, for example, or wings, or any craft. In fact, it doesn't necessarily have to be aircraft.
Yeah. So that's our target. That's where we're going. We presented to the International Aviation Environmental Group earlier this year, and that has all of the airline tier 1, tier 2 and supplier companies in it that are worth their salt, with maybe the exception of a few of the Russian aerospace companies, but all of the big players are in that, and so we had a very exciting engagement with them, and that's starting now to bring people to our door looking for a new approach. But it's a slow burn, but it's a very, very important burn, because they have to get away from using the likes of hexavalent chromate and trivalent chromate and chromium and all of those different materials that they put on surfaces using various different techniques, including electroplating. And they cause human health issues and environmental issues. I don't know if you ever saw that movie, Erin Brockovich.
Yes.
But that's all about that, Erin Brockovich's campaign to stop the use of hexavalent chromate in California. And up to now, you can't really stop it. You can reduce the amount used, but it's so the safety of our aircraft when they're airborne is dependent on hexavalent chromate at the moment and other very toxic materials. But our technology exceeds the bonding strength of anything that's used in the aerospace sector at the moment.
So I suppose going forward, you have solutions that are applicable to medical science, to space, to aircraft, to any kind of craft, any kind of sort of material strength essence. And I suppose the key thing there is, I suppose, that you discover all of these opportunities. In terms of your kind of the space industry, I know persistence is an issue, and getting involved in the space industry might be onerous and difficult. From that perspective, like once you got into the space industry or once you accessed it, has that opened up other opportunities for you? Do you think that there will be other things that will come along for you based on what you've done on the solar orbiter? Like, is it going to be beneficial to you in the long run to have that in your bag, as they say, for going forward?
Oh, we call it our Spitzer's window. It's what gives people an insight into what's possible with a very fundamental old technology to be, at the top of the queue in terms of changing how things can be done. And if you look out there at industry in general, an awful lot of things that we use today are recycled and upgraded and recycled again. We've just taken, one of the oldest methods of changing a metal surface and rejigged it to do new things. We've taken something that is used to take materials off of a metal surface to actually deposit onto metal. So we've turned it on its head, but it's fundamentally the same as what it always was. We're not using, we have some, trade secrets around what we do and built up knowledge, but fundamentally we're using equipment that's used in the grit blasting sector. And that has certain limitations. It has to be line of sight. We can't do the inside of a pipe if you're blasting it from the outside. Whereas if you use wet chemistry, you just put it into a bath and every surface that's available gets coated. But that's part of the problem we have to overcome as well. In industry today, is we have to get away from using things that are convenient but dirty, and using our heads to do things in a different way. And so that area that you pointed out to, lightweighting for the particularly aerospace and automotive, are big target areas for us at the moment. Yeah.
John, it's been an absolute pleasure. We've covered lots of different things.
Yeah.
I think
we've gone from inner space to outer space.
Inner space to outer space. And it's really interesting, the fact that what you do touches everything. It has applications in lots of different things, and that for people listening out there who might be, considering, well, what has this got to do with space, or how could I get involved with space? You may not realise what you have. You may not realise that what you're doing or what you're working on might have absolutely massive implications or use somewhere else. And I think it's a really important message for people. And I suppose, from the perspective of InBio and the co-blast process, I mean, there are many, many applications, and it's a real testament to your tenacity and to the effort you've put in over the years that you are where you are. I think it's amazing. I suppose in terms of where you could apply this, I think pressures will come eventually from the market for all of these more efficient services that are greener and better and all the rest. And I think that, that's an area where I think a lot of people could look at. I suppose finally, just before we close, I'd just like to see, I mean, in terms of your perspective of that bigger picture and going forward and sort of bringing as many people along as you can, is there any kind of message you'd give? Is there anything that would kind of, be a sort of a beacon or a signpost to people if they wanted to go down these kind of routes? What would you say would be the key thing? What would be the main sort of tenet of your whole kind of work? It's a big question.
I think anybody that's working with materials, right, they need to really look at what they're doing and see, are there wider applications of that technology. Anyone working in the medical arena, eventually they're going to be putting people on the moon to live there for a while. They're going to be, we all know what Elon Musk is trying to do with Mars. So medicine, there's huge obstacles to be overcome. at the moment, and there's people working in that area in Ireland already. I think one of the key things is that people don't realise what space means to us as humans. Like, we're all astronauts. Like, we only have one little spacecraft, and when people start thinking like that they're on a spacecraft, if you see how vast space is and how tiny Earth is in that context, we're on the only spacecraft that matters. And people start thinking about space in a different way. You know, people don't realize that their weather comes via space. A lot of their communication is now going to be via satellite. Their GPS that nearly everybody is using every day, if it's not to find a way to some places, to find how long it's going to take to get there. We're all using space every day. So we're now in the space utilization age. Like, the space age was back in the 60s, but this is the space utilization age, and people don't realize that they're using space every day. So therefore, what you are doing in your day-to-day life, or even maybe as a hobby, might be relevant in terms of opening up more space utilization or space exploration, so that we can take advantage of space, or maybe obviate some of the threats that are coming from space by virtue of what you do every day.
Yeah, I know that the numbers of devices in orbit is phenomenal compared to a few years ago. I mean, Sputnik was the first in 1957. At the end of last year, there was 6,093 satellites in orbit, and depending on who you listen to or read, they say there could be 40,000 in orbit by 2030.
Yeah.
So I think that the use of all of that information for the advantage of people on the Earth is really important. And I think there's going to be an enormous amount of opportunities that'll come out of all of that technology, and I think people need to be able to understand how it might impact them, because, as you quite rightly say, it touches everybody, and the more technology used in space sort of percolates down into our day-to-day life, the more we're going to be involved in space is the overall picture. And I think also that whole idea that we only have one planet, you know, there's the famous the blue orb sort of story when people go into space, and when they see the Earth rise, is that famous picture, you know, where you see the Earth come up, you're behind the moon and you see this Earth, and you realise in the context of space, this is the only place we have, and that if we don't take care of it, there's nowhere else to go. We don't have the technology to go elsewhere. We probably won't for some time, and that's the absolute truth. So what we have to do, I think, nowadays is to work with all of our resources to try and develop what we can, but to the benefit of not just the planet, but each other as well. I think we have to be very cognizant of the fact that if we go forward, all of our technology development has to be considering the environment and the people who use it, and not just maybe for one generation, but for, you know, several going forward.
Yeah.
You know?
If you look at what's happening in the Ukraine war, and if you can parallel how war has changed by virtue of the use of space, and map that onto how our sustainable drive to protecting the planet could change by mapping, using space in a similar way, then we could be on a pathway to doing something about preserving the blue dot that we're on. I think that, you know, there's people out there, you know, working in hotels as chefs and the whole lot, but going home at night and getting online and using data from satellites to do something different.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't preclude anybody in the same way as the maker industry has allowed people to print things at home. You can take data that's being generated on satellites and start looking at how you can protect something on the planet, or sustain something on the planet, or change what we do for the better. And that, to me, is the massive opportunity of what's happening today. Earth observation can become Earth protection.
Yeah.
And anybody can partake in it if they have a laptop and
time,
get up and go. Yeah.
Listen, John, it's been an absolute pleasure. I think that if anybody's interested in bio particularly, you have to get on and see what these guys are capable of. It's quite incredible. John O'Donoghue, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
No problem. And hopefully
here,
for the first of our podcast, this was interesting and entertaining. So thank you, everybody, and goodbye.